All right, hello folks who are on Zoom. Thanks for hanging around for a minute. Wanted to, while I get captions up and going, tell everybody, both folks here and on Zoom, that I've gotten the group project submissions from those of you who have turned them in already. If you haven't, please do so as soon as you can. And I plan to work on those today, and then basically once everybody gets them in. And by Tuesday, let you know the assignments, and then you can shuffle around if you need to do so. So that will be coming. And I'll go ahead and pull up our PowerPoint here. Because I'm never sure if the media will work in here or not, the physical media, I have been going ahead and pulling up our videos and integrating them into the PowerPoints. So it also means we have some more modern videos, which isn't the worst idea. And then means that they're all right here. So I'm going to go ahead and get into the slideshow.
I am one.
And go ahead and turn on the captions over here. And we'll start talking about anxiety disorder. So after mood disorders, anxiety disorders are the most commonly diagnosed, which is why I also put them early in the semester. And so these are things that are pretty common to run into, and you may have experienced them yourself. You may know people in your lives who have experienced them. And so, as I always say, don't diagnose yourself with stuff you haven't been diagnosed with. There's something called med student syndrome where you think you have everything that you learn about. I got that in grad school. I totally get it. But also it may be helpful to you if you're someone who has had these experiences before. I'm just going to do attendance real quick here. And then we will get going. A couple people told me they would be out today. Alrighty, go ahead and get started. All right, so what are the anxiety disorders? They stem from the basic emotion of fear, which we've all experienced, right? It involves the activation of the sympathetic nervous system and the fight, flight, freeze response. And this enables us to respond quickly to dangerous threats. So if there was a poisonous snake or a loaded gun, our bodies would kick in and have us do whatever felt right to our bodies in the moment. So that might be freeze response, deer in headlights, right? If I don't move, maybe nothing will happen to me. It might be fight, like I'm just gonna fight my way out of here. I'm gonna push that gun out of the way. Or it might be flight. I'm never gonna outmaneuver that cobra, so I'm just gonna run backwards and then keep running, right? So these are things that naturally evolved, that keep us safe, that kept our species going. But what happens with anxiety disorders is that stuff kind of gets out of whack. And it can do this in a whole bunch of different components. So fear and panic have a cognitive or subjective component. I feel afraid, I feel terrified. Physiologically, we have things like our heart rate speeding up, our breathing going more shallow. And then there's a behavioral component, that urge to escape or flee, and that can manifest in a lot of different ways in modern society. And so anxiety is a blend of emotions and cognitions, thoughts, that are future-oriented and a little more diffuse than fear. Like fear or panic, there are also cognitive, physiological, and behavioral components, but they are subjectively different than experiencing that true fear or that true panic. So cognitive or subjectively in anxiety, instead of it being feeling afraid or feeling terrified, it involves negative mood. It involves worry about future threats or dangers. It can involve preoccupation with yourself, preoccupation with what's going on around you. And a sense of not being able to predict the future or control it. And not knowing what will happen, that can be really terrifying. Then there's the physiological component. So what happens here is a state of chronic over-arousal, which usually reflects a state of readiness for dealing with a threat should it occur. So it's like you're always getting prepared for that flight or fight response. So you got tension. And that's not good if you're just continually in that state, right? And then the behavioral component here is that anxiety may involve a strong tendency to avoid situations where we might encounter danger. And with some of the disorders we'll talk about, that can make your world smaller and smaller and smaller. The adaptive values of anxiety allow us to prepare for possible threats. And in mild to moderate degrees, anxiety actually enhances learning performance. Although anxiety is often adaptive in those mild to moderate degrees, it's obviously maladaptive when it becomes severe. And this is where we get into the Yerkes-Dodson law, or the Yerkes-Dodson curve. And so you'll see it argues that there's an optimal point of anxiety at which humans perform well, but that too little anxiety or too much anxiety can lead to poor performance. The example I always give is if you were doing an in-class exam, right? If you had no anxiety about it, you probably wouldn't study, right? So then you get there and you might not do so well. If you have too much anxiety about it, you might overstudy. You might not sleep the night before because you're studying. You might get so worked up that when you come in and you look at the exam, everything goes blank, right? But if you have sort of in-between anxiety, like I should probably get some studying in for this, right? Make sure I get some sleep. That's when you're going to perform the best. So that's the Yerkes-Dodson law. Now, there are a whole bunch of different types of anxiety disorders, but there are fewer than there were in the past. So just like they made depressive and other disorders and bipolar and other disorders, they've split a couple of the what used to be anxiety disorders off to be their own categories in the DSM-5. So we've still got generalized anxiety and phobia and panic in anxiety disorders. But now OCD is no longer considered an anxiety disorder. It's an obsessive compulsive and related disorders. And PTSD is within the stress related disorders category. So that's our next chapter. Oops. That's fun. I've never done that before. So generalized anxiety disorder is the one people tend to know the least about, but is actually one of the most common disorders diagnosed. So it's characterized by excessive anxiety under most circumstances and worry about practically everything. People have vague, intense concerns and fearfulness. It's sometimes called free-floating anxiety. And you're not worried about danger, you're just worried about things going wrong. So like if a client came to me and said, oh, I've always been a worrier ever since I was a kid, I knew I'd need to narrow in and look at GAD as a possible diagnosis. So these next two clips are from by showing this clip, I'm in no way endorsing Woody Allen as a person or marrying his adopted daughter or any of that creepy stuff. That being said, this is a nice portrayal of what GAD looks like. So this is from a movie called Hannah and Her Sisters. And in it, he has a health scare. And so you'll see kind of how he reacts to that. Apparently we only have Spanish captions, so apologies. He's undergoing some hearing tests. This is an EEG. They're getting brain waves. This is a brain scan.
I wasn't too happy with the results of your ENG or your BSER either, which is why I sent you to tomography, which was all that stuff you saw rolling around. You see this little gray area here? That gray area is what I had hoped that we wouldn't run into. I'd like you to come in Monday morning for a CAT scan.
A brain scan?
Hello, Zoom folks. So the computer died in the classroom, so I found my laptop now. So thanks for your patience while I found that. And I'll go ahead and reshare here and get back into the clips. You know, always something that keeps us on our toes. All righty. Just try to draw out my battery here. Okay, so we've seen him. Yeah, I don't know how long this is gonna work. We've seen him get diagnosed. And so now we will see sort of his secondary reaction to all that. Full screen is unavailable. All right, we'll just watch it on YouTube. And we're not gonna have sound, I just realized, but we can at least read the captions here. And I'll try to get the computer working in the meantime. So he's getting his brain scan done.
Mr. Sachs, I'm afraid the news is not good.
And the doctor's saying, this isn't good.
Exactly where the tumor is and why we feel that surgery would be of no use. See,
It's over.
this has
I'm face to face.
And
with
he's saying, it's
eternity.
over. I'm face to face with my
Can't
own
believe it,
death,
but
with
now
oblivion. It's
I'm
awful.
so frightened I can't move, speak, or breathe.
And then what
Well,
you
you're
find
just
out
fine.
is he was
absolutely
actually
nothing here at all.
imagining worst
Your
case
tests are all
scenario.
fine.
And the doctor comes in
Must
and says,
admit,
actually, nothing's
I was
wrong.
concerned, given your symptoms. What caused this hearing loss in one ear, I guess we'll never really know for sure, but whatever it was, it's certainly not anything serious at all. I'm very relieved.
That's when he comes out and he's happy. And he's already back to the GAD cycle. So that gives you a nice little indicator of, you know, what can happen in this disease. All right, I'm gonna try one more thing on this computer. And if that doesn't work, we'll probably move rooms here. Sorry, as I move desks around. Because my computer probably only has like 15 minutes worth of battery on it. And of course, the one day I don't have my charger. Okay. That worked and it didn't. Alrighty, folks, we are gonna move right on next door to room one. Zoom people, I'm gonna bring you on my laptop till I get everything turned on over there. And we'll just use the tech over there and turn on the class. I will let computer services know. All right, the adventure. All righty, set y'all up here while I get everything turned on in this room. Okay, that's turning on. Good. Thank you all for your flexibility and patience. Go, right up. All right. know, it's not an exciting day if I don't have to use 3 different computers to teach one lesson, all right? Alrighty, Zoom folks, there might be an echo for a sec as I switch over. I'm gonna try and shut y'all off pretty quickly over here. Okay.